Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On today's episode of the What is Asia podcast, I talked to Murad Jalilov, who is a Ph.D. student at the University of Illinois in Urbana. He specializes in the history and literature of Azerbaijan. We're going to be covering the history of Azerbaijan today, heading all the way up to the modern period. And so without further ado, here we go. Murad, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, I guess just before we get started into the main area here, like, obviously you were born and raised in Azerbaijan and you moved here when you were 18, I believe.
Yes, that's correct.
And I guess maybe the answer is kind of obvious, but why did you want to get into studying Azerbaijani literature and history? Was it just because of your background, your past, or was there something more beyond that?
It was actually very interesting because when I first came to America, I just didn't want anything to do with Azerbaijan and everything like that. I kind of took a break from Azerbaijani and Russian culture and kind of immersed myself in American culture. But then for some reason, I started feeling the nostalgia kind of coming back to me, and I kind of gained this perspective, like a very interesting double perspective where I could see Azerbaijan from a lens of a native and also like an American at the same time when like 4 or 5 years passed. And what pushed me to do it is like I came to the University of Oregon and I realized how little Azerbaijan was explored and how much material there is to like showcase in American academia.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what is it that you study specifically? Like, I'm sure you're still developing a PhD dissertation. So, I mean,
Yes,
maybe you can talk about maybe your master's thesis and how it's developing into a dissertation. But specifically, what are some areas that you specialize in pertaining to Azerbaijan?
My master's thesis was both a literary and a little bit of a historical work where I compared Azerbaijan and Russia and how like Azerbaijan basically manifests itself in Russian literature and why. And there's a historical connection there because one of the casus belli for what's it called for Peter the Great's attack on Azerbaijan, on Persia, I mean, more exactly, was because of a massacre of merchants, Russian merchants, in the city of Shamaha. It was like in 18th century. It was around like 17 20 or something like that, and that was a casus belli for Peter the Great's Persian attack, and that actually manifested in Russian literature, and I showcased that in my master's thesis, and how it was also later a commentary on the the war that occurred in like 1840s and 1860s in the Caucasus between Russia and the Imamites, the North Caucasian like tribes and peoples that fought against the Russian Empire, and that city of Shamaha, which has like great historical significance. What's it called? I can talk about it more later, but it's been a city since the 9th century. How it is like a manifestation of this 19th century war.
Okay. Yeah, I do want to get into that modern period a little bit more. Because I think a lot of people unfamiliar with Azerbaijan don't even know that it used to be incorporated into the Russian political domain. Sorry, can you still hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. But I want to go back a little bit earlier. So, I was reading like the Britannica webpage and like Wikipedia and trying to, before this interview, wrap my head around like the question, what is Azerbaijan? And I guess without going too far back into history, I guess can you start by talking about the early Islamic conquests of this area and sort of take us through to the Mongols, and then I have another question once we get to the Mongols.
Okay, it's actually it's actually very interesting what happens. First, you have like the Azerbaijan was like at that point a part of the Sassanid Empire before the Islamic conquest, but the religion that was predominant in like what's modern day Azerbaijan, which is I would say is north of Iran and between Iran and Russia. Though there's a lot of people also Azerbaijani people. Actually, the majority of Azerbaijani people live in Iran. Like 30 million people live there, and that's like southern Azerbaijan. That's what we call it. Basically, those two nations, those two like Albania and Atropatena, they were both a part of the Sasanian Empire. And once the Arabs attacked in like the 7th century, they completely decimated the Sassanids and conquered Atropatene and conquered what's it called, those territories. But then instead of Azerbaijan, like Albania, more exactly, the Caucasian Albania, not to be confused with the modern European Albania, but this ancient country called Albania gained its independence briefly. But like in 688, it's like voluntarily became a part of the what's it called? Due to like King Javanshir, who was the king of Caucasian Albania, he basically swore fealty to the Arabic, the Umayyad. At that point, that was the Umayyads. He swore fealty to them, and in 688, Albania became a part of the like a vassal state of the Arabs, the Muslims. But then in 705, they actually fully annexed Albania and made it like a fully like Islam part of the Islamic caliphate, full on. And then you had like this period of like Islamization happening, and so this is a very important moment that happens. So once the Arabic Caliphate falls apart, that's when you have a lot more communication between like different parts of Azerbaijan, like where Tabriz is in Iran, or where, like, for example, where Baku is, where Shamahai is. You guys have like basically northern Azerbaijan and southern Azerbaijan. They kind of become like one ethnicity. That's like a Turkic-speaking ethnicity. They were never like called. They were never called like Azerbaijanis. They were just called like Turks or Turkey. Like they were never like. But a lot of them, like for example, though, a uh, a country called the Shirvanshahs gained its independence in 861 from the Arabic Caliphate, and the capital was Shamaha, the city I wrote about, and it was very famous for its silk. Their official language, despite like the population speaking Arabic or Persian, not Arabic and Persian, despite the population speaking Turkic languages, basically their official language was Persian and Arabic that they used for. They used Persian as an official government language and Arabic as a religious language, though the common language was like Turkic. But then I think it was around like the 11th century, the very beginning of 11th century. Uh, it gets the country gets conquered by the Seljuks. Be like, and it's easily conquered because like there's so many like countries there. There was like a period where like there were so many countries just falling and forming in that territory. You couldn't even just keep up with history. The only like stable country that was there. It was, I would say, it was the Shirvan Shahs. Every other like all the other counties or all the other like dynasties that were on the territory of modern day Azerbaijan and modern day northern Iran, they would just form and fall apart, form and fall apart. Okay, but then the Seljuks come in. The Seljuk Turks, they come in from um, the east. They come in from the territory of modern day Central Asia, and they go through Iran. They conquer Iran. They go to Azerbaijan. They conquer Azerbaijan and vassalize the Shirvan Shahs. See, the Shirvan Shahs, the Shirvan Shahs don't get conquered; they get vassalized, and then, as you know, the Turks also conquer the Byzantine, a lot of the territories of the Byzantine Empire, the Seljuk Turks. So in 1071 especially, and this causes a lot of like the Turkic tribes to move to Azerbaijan and Turkey, and kind of that's actually finishes the process of Turkization of Azerbaijan. They become a lot. There's a lot more Turkic speakers are there now. Because it's like there were already Turkic speakers there, but now they're like mixing with the local Arab, Persian speaking populations as well, forming a Turkic ethnicity that like you could see to this day. So if you actually like check the genetics of Azerbaijani people, which is very interesting, it would say that we're not mostly Turkic, but we're Turkic speaking. It was kind of like a very weird situation. Where it's like genetically we're not Turks, but we're Turkic speaking. So there obviously there are some Turkic people with Turkic admixture too, but it's like basically we're kind of like mix of Arabs and I don't know, I would say Persians and also Turks kind of. It's a very weird genetic mixture, but this is like the 11th and 12th centuries is when it's full on established who we are as peoples, but it was never called Azerbaijan back then. Okay, so once the Seljuks conquered us, it was stable for a while, but then there was another like very big vassal state in on the territory of Iran and Azerbaijan. Now this is where the history gets merged again. We become kind of like the Atabeks become kind of like the Atabeks are the rulers of like modern day Azerbaijan from the Kura River, which is like not the most northern part of Azerbaijan is the Shirvan Shahs, so they're not like a part of this bigger state, but this bigger state forms and called the Atabeks, and at first they are what's it called? At first, they're just vassals of the Seljuks, but once the Seljuk fall, they become an independent state. However, as it always goes during the Middle Ages, this is actually a very fun event. I always find it hilarious. Where the Shirvan Shahs, another Azerbaijani state, right, and Georgia, the country, it's the modern day Georgia. They united together against this Atabek Seljuk Azerbaijani kind of state. They're basically like Shirvan Shahs were the same ethnicity, but like they still like united and attacked what's it called the Atabeks and completely ravished them. And now we get to the Mongol.
One thing I don't think a lot of people think about is how uniquely placed Azerbaijan is geographically. And I guess we didn't cover this, but for people who don't know, Azerbaijan is right off of the coast of the Caspian Sea, and so if that gives anyone a little better idea.
Between Iran and Russia.
Right, between Iran and Russia, and to its east is to its west is Armenia.
Yes, Armenia and Georgia, yeah.
Right. And I think people tend to think just about Azerbaijan as a, in the post Russia time, but I don't think a lot of people think too much about how much of a confluence of influences that it has going back to its influences with the Arabic world and its influences with East Asia, which we'll get into now. So Genghis Khan or the Mongols in general, when do they invade Azerbaijan? Does it all take place at once, or does it take place over sort of a long span of time?
Oh, it happens in a long span of time. So right before the Atabeks fall, there was like this very first like attack of the Mongols, which I think happened around like 1220 or 1220, between 1220 and 2022. It was not Genghis Khan himself; it was his what's it called? I forgot the names for the life of me. But it was
his son or his grandson?
no, it wasn't his son or grandson. It was his what's it called? His military, two of his military leaders. They were in charge of two of his generals, basically, passed through Azerbaijan. They ravaged a lot of the cities like Maraga, completely destroyed the Tabriz. Basically, when they went through Persia, and they were like Persia, Iran, like modern day. Iran's a little bit of a different concept. I'll explain it later. But Persia, they ravaged Persia. They ravaged, southern Azerbaijan, which is like Tabriz, Maraga. They ravaged, they also ravaged, like, I think the Shirvanshahs too, but the Shirvanshahs immediately made a deal with them. So they weren't exactly like, again, if you've noticed, the Shirvanshahs, even though they get conquered, they always kind of weasel their way out and make deals with all the conquerors that come that way. Mm-hmm. So the Shirvanshahs remained, everyone else got like kind of ravaged. And the Atabeks after this, like after the Mongols left in 2023, they were in absolute ruin, right? Mm. So right as the Mongols left, here's what happens before the second Mongol attack. This is actually the very interesting part. Basically, do you know the Khwarezm Shahs?
No, what's that?
Basically, it was a state to the west from where Genghis Khan was, and Genghis Khan sent his ambassadors to Khwarezm Shah, to the Khwarezm Shah. The Khwarezm Shah, I think it was Jalal ad-Din at the time. He basically, what he did was he sent to Genghis Khan the head of the ambassador, saying we don't agree to your rule and everything. Mm-hmm. Back to Genghis Khan. Obviously, that made Genghis Khan angry, and Genghis Khan literally just attacked and destroyed their state, which was very interesting. The retreating Khwarezm Shah army, guess what they did?
What?
They literally, Jalal ad-Din, he literally conquered what remained of the Atabeks. So he conquered all of Persia and all of Azerbaijan after being ravaged by the Mongols. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of this very weird situation where literally...
And what year did this happen?
2025. No, sorry, not 1225.
Yeah, and earlier you said 2023. I think you meant 1223, right?
Well, 1223.
Right, and then, sorry, this person's name again, who conquered Azerbaijan?
Jalal ad-Din.
Jalal ad-Din. He made this huge stride militarily in 1225, correct?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
but his state was destroyed. So he literally like moved his remaining army, and he literally conquered Persia and what's it called? What's modern day Azerbaijan, because it was already ravaged by the Mongols.
Often one of the side effects of invasion is that there's a transmission of culture. So you have Azerbaijan that's sort of at this crossroads between uh, Islamic influence, but also influence from the East, and along with so like I'm thinking about my own field in Chinese history. So the North Song was all but consumed by the Mongols by 1195. So I would imagine that they would have carried over with them by the time they had invaded Azerbaijan. They would have carried over with them a lot of influence from China, maybe Korea. Is that reflected in the culture of Azerbaijan at this time and the times going forward, this mix between Islamic and Far East culture? Or how does that look culturally?
We've had a connection with China since before that. Like,
Right, I would imagine because of the Silk Road too.
yeah, because of Silk Road and passed through Azerbaijan, yes.
Right.
And literally, like I said, Shamaha was known for its silk. That's what appears in like the Russian fairy tale I wrote a thesis on, is like Shamahan silk. The silk making came to Azerbaijan, that came from China. What else? That's like the biggest thing that I saw being like carried over. Honestly, I mean, we can come to modern day and we still have connections with China, but like basically, Azerbaijan was aware of China's existence all this time.
Right, and um, the whole Arabic world is interesting in that sense because it's always been a bridge between the Far East and Europe. And so it's sort of getting this mix of both worlds. And so it makes sense that Azerbaijan was caught right in the middle of that.
One thing I can say is that the Turks is like the biggest connection. Our Turkic, well, both China and Azerbaijan were invaded by Turkic peoples, and that's why our language is Turkic. And the culture is Turkic as well. It's very similar to the cultures in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan that border China, and we're even close to like with Uyghurs and stuff. We have like similar languages as they do, but like that's like the biggest thing is that we had common invaders, and I would believe that Turkic culture might have gotten something from the Chinese culture. I know exactly what, but
yeah, and it's hard for me to say too. Like I said in the at the beginning, it's it's hard for me to say too much in this interview because I know so little about Azerbaijan.
One thing I could say is like maybe the fighting styles got exported from China because the way that Turkic people like fight with each other and everything, they were a lot into like wrestling, a lot into martial arts, but their martial arts had a very specific like taste to them. They're not exactly like Chinese martial arts, but there are martial arts. It's mostly like wrestling though.
We have this pushback against the Mongols in 1225. And can you take us through just sort of like the important points of what happens between then and the next note that I have is the Azerbaijan Republic in 1918. So okay. We're talking about a huge gap of time here, but can you sort of take us? Yeah. But yeah, can you take us just through like the important historical points? What happens between 1225 and 1918?
Okay, so 1225, Jalaluddin conquers Azerbaijan, and then for 6 years he rules. He gets conquered by the Mongols, and Mongols actually in 1231. So he only rules for six years until he's conquered in 1231 by Mongols again. So he lost to them twice, and he gets killed in India. Anyhow, he was a very interesting man. That happens, then Azerbaijan's kind of incorporated into the Mongol Empire. Then it becomes a part of the, I think it's 1337, it becomes a part of the Ilkhanate. Mm-hmm. And the Ilkhanate, which is like also the Mongols. And finally gets rid of the Mongol rule around like the 15th century. There's like new countries forming there. First, there's the Turkic country of Karakoyunlu, which is like a Turkic country. Again, the Shirvanshahs retained their independence. They just Karakoyunlu vassalizes them. Then you get to Akkoyunlu, which conquers Karakoyunlu. Basically the black sheep Turkmen gets conquered by the white sheep Turkmen. It's kind of weird.
What does that mean, black sheep Turkmen?
It's just like their families, their dynasties, kind of. The black sheep Turks were like, they had a black sheep as their symbol, and then you had the white sheep Turks that lived with the black sheep Turks, but they were a completely different feudal state. So they conquered the black sheep Turks, and once white sheep Turks like came to be, this is where Iran forms. By the way, it was mostly a Turkic state up until this point, and even after that for a few years. But this is a very important event. While the white sheep Turks like rule over Iran and most of Azerbaijan, except for Shirvanshahs, who are vassalized, finally we have this religious order rise up. This was a Shia religious order, and part of this religious order was like Ismail Shah, who became like Ismail. It was Ismail Shah, and he was somehow related to the ruling dynasty of the White Sheep Turks. So the guy, the baby, when he was a baby, he was like had to be transported somewhere else because his whole family was killed. Okay, so in 1500 exactly, and he comes back and he conquers all of White Sheep Turks, which is like all of Iran and all of like most of Azerbaijan, and he vassalizes the Shirvanshahs again, and he forms this one Shiite state that is Shiite Islamic state that is what's it called? That is both like Azerbaijani and Persian, or how do we call it nowadays, Iranian kind of state. He basically finally restores the Persian Empire since the Arabic conquests. Then his son comes to power, and that's when he changes the capital from Azerbaijani city of Tabriz to Persian city Kazvin, which is like, and then Abbas comes and finally changes to Isfahan, and that kind of completes the Persianization of the area. Persian became the more like Persia in the like basically the Safavids became more Persian than Turkic in like the in the 15th 16th century. Mm-hmm. Centuries. And finally, also funny fact.
So let me just ask you too. It seems like because throughout Azerbaijan's history that we've talked about so far, there seems to be such tremendous influence coming from Persia. Were people in Azerbaijan writing in Arabic?
They used to. They used to write in Arabic, but it all came to an end in 1918, which I'm coming to really quickly.
Right, which we'll get to in a minute.
Okay, so by the way, also the Safavids, they were having none of like the Shirvanshahs. They're always like, oh, let me be your vassal, let me be your vassal. They were like, no, we're annexing you. So they literally, after like, from 1861 to 1538, the state existed, and they like annexed it. The Shirvanshahs. They
right.
They
you mean 1361?
No, 15. 38. the Safavids annexed the Shirvanshahs.
Mm-hmm.
That state existed since 861.
Oh, 861. Okay.
To
You said 1861, so I just
sorry,
yeah.
from 861 to like 1538. Anyhow, then the Safavids they rule until the 18th century. See, I told you this is gonna go quickly.
Uh-huh.
Then they fall apart. Nadir Shah comes. Finally, like while the Safavids rule, by the way, Russia finally attacks. The first time we fought with Russia was in 1658.
Okay.
Like the Safavids and Russia clashed, but then in later on, in like the 1735, and then throughout that history, Persia and Russia clashed over Azerbaijan, but mostly Persia retained that until Azerbaijan fell apart into very small states in like the late 18th century. There were different khanates. There were different feudal khanates. They were all small. They were very small. It was like each city or 2-3 cities were forming like a small kingdom, if you know what I'm saying. It's like a period of like the feudal, like, I don't know, shattering kind of.
And so you said in 1658 Russia invaded.
They didn't invade. They clashed.
Okay, they clashed.
They invaded, and Peter the Great invaded in around 1720.
Okay, I see.
And kept those territories until 1735. But then Nadir Shah liberated those territories from Russia around that time.
Okay, and then after that period, that's when you start seeing all of these feudal states form.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, we even had one weird. By the way, this is a very fun fact. We even had this one weird feudal republic. It was like literally a republic that was like not a feudal republic, sorry, village republic. It was a republic that was basically based on villages, and it was in it was a very small state. There was like 8 villages there, but basically it was governed by councils of old people chosen by the village.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was a very weird kind of a structure, and more. So we did have a democratic state technically then, but then there was like a what's it called? In the 19th century, finally we get to 19th century. There was a clash between the Persians and the Russians. Not a clash, but a war. And finally, this is where Azerbaijan gets separated, by the way. In 1813, northern Azerbaijan. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, 1 second. Yeah. I apologize.
Go ahead.
Cut this part out. Okay.
Yeah.
In the 19th century, in the early 19th century, in 1813 to be in particular, Persia and Russia had a war between 1805 and 1813. Russia conquered all the northern Azerbaijani states, and annexed them to what's it called? To its territory, full on. And this is how, and southern Azerbaijan remained like in Persian's control. Then in 1826 and 1828, they had another war, and the rest of the territory of Armenia, which surprisingly, I'm not going to get more into that, but it was also integrated within Azerbaijan. But what was interesting, it was 2 Azerbaijani dynasties ruling over at that point, over like the Nakhchivan and Yerevan like Khanates. And it was weird. It was like basically the population was predominantly Armenian, but they were ruled by the Azerbaijanis back then.
And again, what time frame was this?
This was 1826, 1828.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, and then Russia annexes the territory, annexes the territory of northern Azerbaijan, and then the rest of it remains like in Iran. Yeah, Azerbaijani people write in Arabic. Meanwhile, they finally within Russia's territory, they finally developed their like what's it called, typography. One guy, even Mirza Fatali Akhundzada, develops a Latin-based Azerbaijani alphabet. So when Azerbaijan was a part of Russia, it kind of went through this weird period of westernization. And it kind of started becoming more and more a part of Russia, and especially with the oil boom that happened in Baku. When oil became very important in the late 19th century, a lot of foreign companies started moving to Azerbaijan, to Baku, and it kind of became the most like Western city and the most diverse city in Azerbaijan. It was an international city. The oil boom was like insane. It brought a lot of development, electricity, trains to Azerbaijan. Okay, with all that happening, there were also bloody crashes in the beginning of between Armenians and Azerbaijanis and the Russians in the 20th century, early 20th century, like 1905. And finally, during the October,
that clash over, why were they fighting?
It was just like the Russian government kind of deliberately created tensions between Azerbaijanis and Armenians. There wasn't like a general cause. It was just, oh, you're different. How people explain it though, usually, it was because Armenians were richer than the local population of Baku, for example. They were richer than the Azerbaijani population, and the Azerbaijani population thought they were being treated unfairly, and they started like clashing with Armenians, and both sides were massacred. Unfortunately, this is where like the conflict starts, like full on. This is like where it takes root the most, I would say. Now those clashes are happening. That ethnic tension is there. Now you have the 1917 revolution, and Russia starts falling apart. First, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia create one single country called the Transcaucasian Federation, but that only lasts for a few months before it falls apart to the Azerbaijani Democratic Republic, Georgian Democratic Republic, and the Armenian Democratic Republic. And Armenia and Azerbaijan start clashing over Karabakh in 1918 to 1920, since the very inception of both countries as democratic republics.
And what was this, for all intents and purposes, an effective democracy, or was it?
It didn't last long. So I studied this guy, a famous Azerbaijani writer, doctor, and a communist leader called Nariman Narimanov, who lived in Azerbaijan, who was like a part of the Communist Party. What happened was in 1920, it got invaded by the Soviet Union and annexed by the Soviet Union. And Nariman Narimanov was put as the leader of the Azerbaijani Republic until 1925, when he was like he suspiciously died in Moscow. Yeah, but yeah, that's how he brought communism to Azerbaijan. And while the effects were kind of devastating of communism on Azerbaijan, I can talk about the Soviet era a lot. One thing that improved was the literacy rate. The literacy rate when Azerbaijan was conquered was like 0.2%. Only the elites were literate. Everyone else, the whole population, was illiterate. But in those short 5 years, literacy rates like reached 90 to 99%. However, a lot of people actually lost their like money. The communists kind of like what's it called? They've put down a lot of uprisings against the communist rule in the city of Ganja or in the city of Shaki. Do you want me to talk about the Stalinist period or no?
That I do want to get into that. So Russia incorporates Azerbaijan into their political domain in 1920, I believe, right?
No, it was already in 1813. It was already a part of Russia.
But I thought in 1918 they'd effectively separated from Russia, right?
They did, but for only 2 years.
Right, and then it went back to Russia in
Yes.
1920, correct?
Yes. So basically, it was never out of the Russian influence to begin with.
So yeah, I guess, and then I believe I'm trying to remember my history here. 1929 is when Stalin comes into power.
Yeah, when he fully usurps power. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I guess just get into that. So we're seeing an Azerbaijan that has a growing literacy rate. We're before 1929, were the common people generally more well fed, better off?
Yes, they were well fed, better off. There was thriving of theater, thriving of everything. There was not that much socialism. There was a lot of socialism involved, but it wasn't that bad. The only thing that was kind of bad was the uprising, where the communists killed a lot of people, around I think 10 to 20,000. I might be mistaken, maybe more.
And what year did this happen?
I think that was 1921.
Okay, 1920. We get to 1929. Stalin comes into power. Of course, he implements a lot of very controversial policies, which affected a lot of people. Sorry.
This is very important. We switched to a Latin alphabet during 1920 and 1929. By the way.
Okay. Okay, but in Russia they use the Cyrillic alphabet.
Yes, that's when Stalin comes in.
Correct. Okay, so then in 1929, then Azerbaijan switches to the Cyrillic alphabet.
Yes.
Okay, and that's when. So before 1929, were people in Azerbaijan not speaking Russian?
They were speaking Russian. A lot of them were speaking Russian, but not as much as when the Soviets came in.
This was more in 1929 when Russian became very prominent in Azerbaijan.
Yeah. Yes, I mean it's in 1920 it became prominent. I'll be honest.
Okay.
But it became more now with the Cyrilization, it was actually easier for both Russian people to read Azerbaijani and Azerbaijani people to read Russian.
So I guess some of these next questions I'm going to ask pertain to Stalin and his policies on Azerbaijan. I'm sure you've read him. I've read a little bit of Stephen Kotkin, who's a professor of Russian history at Princeton. And just from some of the surface level material that I've read, he talks about specifically how his policies in areas outside of Russia proper were actually more damaging than beneficial. And he talks about places like for example, Kazakhstan used to be a part of Russia.
When they were collectivized, a lot of people in Kazakhstan died.
I was just about to say collectivization. So I guess you're probably better to talk about this. First of all, what is collectivization? What does that mean?
So collectivization is when they basically take all the independent peasants that do their jobs for themselves and put them in specific collective farms called kolkhoz. Коллективное хозяйство, basically meaning collective farm or kolkhoz. And what happens there is that they have to work and give a portion of their what they grow and what they make to the state, and sometimes the state would just take everything away. Mm-hmm. So that's why they were starved. That's it's a lot more complex than that, but this is the basics why this policy failed, because it was very mismanaged, and a lot of people were collectivized against their will. Yes.
Was this happening in Azerbaijan as well?
This was, but it didn't cause. It caused a little bit of a famine, but not a widespread famine as it was in Ukraine or Kazakhstan, though.
Mm-hmm. So I guess just explain for people what was going on politically and socially in Azerbaijan during the Stalinist period.
Well, before the Stalinist period, there was a lot of Azerbaijan. First of all, in 1918, was a secular nation. It was not a religious nation. It was a secular nation. And then when it got conquered, it was a secular nation. Like during this early Soviet period. And then that's where you had the rise in women rights. You got a lot of modernist Azerbaijani poets coming to the scene, and they managed to express their poetry quite freely without many consequences before the Stalinist period. So that's why it was good, because relatively good, not the best, but basically they managed to write their poetry, write their novels and everything, write their plays, and it was this rise in Azerbaijani culture. That's when it started to be developing. But this is where also around the time where Azerbaijanis started calling themselves Azerbaijanis, by the way, the 1920s. But in 1930s, it was pinned in the constitution, that the ethnicity, they're not just called Turks. They are literally Azerbaijanis, because the country was called before that was Azerbaijan, so they retained that name. So Stalin, instead of calling us Azerbaijani Turks, started calling us Azerbaijanis as to separate us from Turkey, because as you remember, I mentioned the Seljuk Turks when they came in. The ethnicity is the same, and it's still the same as the one we have in Turkey, but this is when ethnicity started to separate a lot more than they have been. So instead of saying Azerbaijani Turks, we just became Azerbaijanis, or Caucasian Turks, we just became Azerbaijanis. That was one of the policies. We were completely severed from Turkey and became, I would say, our own people. Still, we have a lot of connection with Turkey, but we kind of became our own people. That's what else? A lot of those writers that were really popular in the 1920s.
Let me just stop you real quick, because there's something I wanted to clarify here. So Russian nationalism, as I understand it, there was obviously a lot of great Russian nationalism during the Stalinist period, and would people in Azerbaijan have called themselves Azerbaijani or Russian?
Azerbaijani or Soviets. Stalin was a little weird when it came to. They still called themselves Azerbaijanis, but
it was not considered offensive to not consider yourself Russian.
No, Stalin changed his mind on that a lot of times. But one thing Stalin wanted to do is that he wanted to get rid of culture entirely. So he wanted to ban Azerbaijani national instruments. And one of the poets, that's part of the reason why he was repressed. He wrote a poem that's praised national instruments, and he got repressed for it and sent to Kazakhstan and killed there. My what's it called, great grandpa, he was a prominent intellectual in Azerbaijan in the 19th and 20th centuries. He was sent to Kazakhstan and killed in 1938. A lot of the Azerbaijani writers usually got sent to Kazakhstan to get killed. Who else? Hussein Javid, very famous Azerbaijani writer, playwright, got killed, and a lot of people who didn't praise Stalin got massacred during that period.
Stalin dies in 1951, I think. 1953.
Do you want me to talk about the World War briefly?
Yeah. I guess I unintentionally skipped over that, but yeah, go ahead.
World War I was also a bloodbath, for example, but the Ottoman Empire was involved in liberating Baku during World War One.
Yeah.
That's a completely separate topic. It's very complex. I don't want to get into that much. But World War II is actually pretty simple. So 1 million Azerbaijanis were drafted, around 1 million. I think 300,000 of them died, but the Germans never bombed or reached Azerbaijan. But yeah, 1 million men were drafted. 300,000 died. I think 100,000 of them deserted to the Nazis, and 400,000 survived. But there was a Nazi collaborationist, Azerbaijani general. I don't remember what his name was, but there was a Nazi collaborational general. But there were a lot of also Soviet generals that were what was their names? Hazi Aslanov, for example. Mehdi Hussein-Zadeh, who was also a hero. He wasn't exactly he was a partisan. He wasn't a general, but he's very famous. Yeah, a lot of generals are mostly famous for fighting for the Soviet Union, but there was one who was fighting for Germany. And actually, this is a very hilarious point. I find it personally funny that the leaders of the Azerbaijani Democratic Republic try to, which I find very abhorrent. I mean, I know why they were trying to do that, but that was very messed up, in my opinion. They literally tried to negotiate with. So this was the leadership of the republic that existed between 1918 and 1920, right? And they basically tried to strike up a deal with Hitler to create an independent Azerbaijan again, which was wow.
Wow. And again, what year was this that they tried to do this?
They want to do that in 1941, 1943.
Wow.
The former leadership. So it's okay. Anyhow, that happens. Azerbaijan remains a part of the Soviet Union. Stalin dies.
So then after that, this is kind of my flimsiness with Russian history. I think Khrushchev was next after.
Yeah.
Does his policy toward Azerbaijani people change? Does collectivism collectivism loosen up? Does he allow culture in Azerbaijan to flourish? Does collectivism loosen up?
It kind of loosens up, yes. It loosens up. We have because of Khrushchev, we have a very rich film culture. Azerbaijan had a lot of films. Azerbaijan had a lot of theaters. The culture does kind of liberate, become more free because of Khrushchev. There's a lot of cultural upheaval. There's no more praising Stalin. In fact, Stalin gets censored, and people start I don't know. A lot of the Azerbaijan becomes other than oil, the industry that produces cotton starts to manifest in Azerbaijan. And other crops. Yeah, it loosens up. Collectivization kind of loosens up. It's no longer a Stalin's dictatorship. It's it's like an authoritarian socialist state. It's not it's totalitarian stuff, but it's not absolute anymore. Yeah, a lot of films were made during that era. Though.
So this was considered sort of a culturally flourishing time for Azerbaijan, because I'd imagine, have film technology. It seems like people, based on what I'm hearing, were able to, do more plays, work with more instruments, more poetry. It seems all of that would have had more of an opportunity to grow.
By the way, and this was one of the moments, maybe you'll be interested in this, but the Khrushchev period was around the time where relationship with China started to sour a little bit. And the Chinese thought because the Chinese were going their own direction and Khrushchev was going his own direction. There was always this fear of China attacking at some point.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They were both. They both wanted to sort of be the pinnacle country of communism, the pinnacle representation
Yes.
of communism.
Yes.
So after, again, I'm not familiar enough with Russian history. After Khrushchev dies, who's after Khrushchev?
That's Brezhnev.
Brezhnev.
And he returns some of Stalin's policies, but at the same time, it's like Khrushchev didn't die. He got ousted by Brezhnev in 1963. 1964, sorry. Yeah, he gets ousted by Brezhnev. And Brezhnev is basically kind of inactive leader. It's a period of stagnation. Not much changes except for what's it called? He becomes a little bit tougher on the people.
I guess let me jump to Gorbachev because um, he's the last leader of the Soviet Union before its demise in 1991. Um, Gorbachev, I think in some ways he's well, not in some ways, but in many ways he's painted as being a leader that wasn't able to control the shrinking of Russia. He's
Yes.
maybe characterized as being weak in some ways because, of course, Russia was already sort of in decline when he assumed power.
Well, it wasn't in decline. It was kind of stagnant, I would say. The issue was that they didn't develop they were very closed off and they didn't develop the same industries as like the Western countries developed. And what the difference, like for example, between what happened is because the Russian Empire, for example, it wasn't separated into separate countries; it was separated into several different governments. But the Soviet Union, it had like a lot of what's it called? It had like a lot of republics, and people usually gravitated towards the republics where like their ethnicity was like the dominating ethnicity, and there was like a rise of nationalism by the time Gorbachev already came to power. Because the Russian Empire used to be a very diverse country. Only 53% of the population of Azerbaijan was Azerbaijani when the Soviet Union conquered it. And now it was like 86 to like almost 90% Azerbaijani, for example. So there was an obvious rise in nationalism. And with this decline, it kind of started becoming more and more prominent.
So I have a question. If people weren't really calling themselves Azerbaijani until the 20th century, how are we characterizing who counts as being Azerbaijani?
Turkic speaking people that live in Azerbaijan, basically.
But so I guess there's sort of a fuzzy line then because someone can be a Turkic speaking person that lives in Turkey and they would consider themselves Turkish, but if one of their generations later immigrated to Azerbaijan, then they can consider themselves Azerbaijani. Would that be correct? Okay. Um, so I guess just to jump into Gorbachev, and then I'll have just a couple more questions about the modern era. Um, because the Russian state was shrinking at this time, was there a growing sense of Azerbaijan identity, culture?
Yes, nationalism was on the rise everywhere, not just in Azerbaijan.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and it was led by the National Front of Azerbaijan. There were like the people started protesting and everything like that, and that eventually led to Bloody January in 1990, where Russia tried to quell it. Unfortunately, like I know, sorry. Unfortunately, a lot of people died, but like it's really weird for me to say because a lot of people still miss the Soviet era because there was stability and prosperity compared to what's happening right now. But also at the same time, it's just like it is a very key moment where the Soviets just stop existing, like they fall apart, and the new nationalistic governments take over. And the war with Armenia begins already in 19. So because like both like Armenia and Azerbaijan have the national upheavals in 1988, there were already clashes happening in Karabakh. Basically, those were the tensions that were still, what's it called, there since the 1920s.
I just want to ask two more questions here before we wrap up. The first is, what in today's Azerbaijan, so I'm jumping forward 30 years later, in the Azerbaijan that we know today, have they, it seems like they've retained a lot of that former Russian presence. So, and this is just my unfamiliarity, are people in Azerbaijan speaking Russian, or is Azerbaijani is that a distinct language?
Okay, so the elites in Baku, or some people in Baku, like myself, that's word in Baku, we speak Russian. Russian is our first language. Russian is our mother language. And how English is not the language of the English, Russian is not the language of the Russians anymore, if you know what I'm saying. They were like the titular people, but I feel like we owned it. But there's some Azerbaijani people that speak Azerbaijani Turkic, which is closer to Turkish, and they like want to eradicate that Russian-speaking portion of the population. So there's like very weird tensions happening right now. Like there was a journalist that said like we should kill all the what's it called Russian-speaking Azeris, which is like wow. But no, a lot of Azerbaijanis are bilingual. They can speak Russian. Some of them are trilingual. They can speak like Turkish, Azerbaijani, and Russian. And some people can even speak like English in addition to that.
Yeah. What is Azerbaijan look like politically? Like, is it a democratic?
It is a dictatorship, and the son of the. It's basically like it's very weird. So the guy who was the communist leader of Azerbaijan, he became the leader of Azerbaijan in 1991 again. In 1993 again, after 2 years of brief like nationalist rule. But this time he didn't rule like a communist, or he didn't answer to Moscow. He answered to himself, and he created this dictatorial state based on his cult of personality. And then his son took over and continued the same policy. They came to power through a military coup, and it's an oil-rich dictatorship. The people are kind of poor, I would say. There's a few like billionaires, millionaires that are like friends of the president, and it's not good right now. It's not good.
Just my last question is, so obviously I'm sure this is a very complicated issue, but it's something that's very topical. Armenia and Azerbaijan recently had a war. For people who don't know what the reason was, what that war looked like, and what the outcome was, can you give a brief description of what that's all about?
I kind of gave it throughout this kind of a little bit, kind of was planting the seeds for it a little bit, why it happened. So there was like this very disputed territory in Azerbaijan, and still is, called Nagorno-Karabakh, where there were a lot of Armenians living there and a lot of Azerbaijanis, right? And it's one of those fuzzy regions where they couldn't figure out to whom it belongs to, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first time the war started in like 1920, because Armenia was not happy because it was like integrated by the peace treaty to the territory of Azerbaijan in 1918 and 1920. But it didn't like Azerbaijan and Armenia hated each other back then. Like the governments hated each other, but Armenians still live in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijanis still live in Armenia by that time. Yeah, there were massacres that were horrible, but they still lived together. But the way it manifested in 1988 and until 1994, when the first war happened, where Armenia won and conquered the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh and more than that, basically cleansing some ethnically Azerbaijani territories. That's when, because of the ethnic cleansing by the Armenians, both sides kind of basically Armenians sent their Azerbaijani populations to Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijanis sent their Armenian populations, like all of them, to Armenia. So it was a lot more brutal than the 1918-1920 war. So Armenia won that war, and Azerbaijan again in 2020 went to war with the Armenians, and it didn't recapture all the territory it's lost, but it's recaptured mostly the regions where Azerbaijanis used to be the majority population, like 99-98% of the population. Mm-hmm. And what was very interesting, and look, I'm not picking sides here. I don't have a bias. I try not having a bias because I see where both sides are coming from. But like all those territories that Azerbaijan recaptured, except for Shusha or Shushi, how they call it, all of them used to have 99-98% of the percent of their population used to be Azerbaijanis that became like internally displaced. We come back there after the war, and there's absolutely no infrastructure there. Absolutely none since the Soviet Union fell. Almost nothing, which is weird because it's just like, so they basically kept that territory as a security belt. So literally right now it's like an unpopulated wasteland, except for the territories that Armenia / the unrecognized Nagorno-Karabakh Republic retained. And now Russia is there, and Russia basically is the key player in that region. It was a key player to begin with. It was the one who pitted Armenia and Azerbaijan against each other to begin with. But now it has its troops in Nagorno-Karabakh, in that disputed region, to keep the peace.
So right now, Russia has soldiers in those areas.
Oh yes.
I see.
So Russia increased its influence in Azerbaijan and Armenia.
So in some ways, we could say that the biggest winner between this conflict between these two countries was a third party, which was Russia. And I'd imagine that this has to do with Putin's dream of sort of one day recreating the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's all Putin's work. A lot of innocent people died for nothing, in my opinion.
Okay, well, I did say I only had 2 more questions, but I do have one more. It's a very quick, rapid-fire question. For people who are interested in reading more about the history of Azerbaijan, can you recommend 1 or 2 books here for people to read?
I recommend, if you want a historical book, she has a very, very strong obsession with Azerbaijan. I recommend The American Historian, and to you, Nakota, I also recommend her. Read her. She's amazing. Audrey Altstad. Audrey Altstad.
Okay.
She's a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and she wrote 3 books about Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan's like history during the Tsarist Russia, one about Azerbaijan's history during the Soviet Union, and one about Azerbaijan's modern period before the Karabakh War, like the Second Karabakh War. So she's probably going to write a 4th book soon, but we'll see. Mm-hmm. She basically explains everything that you need to know about Azerbaijan. I cannot think off top of my head. There was one more book that was very good. I think it was by Tyrell, but her name was Tyrell. She wrote about Azerbaijan. But the book that stands out the most, like I said, is the Audrey Altstad books that were published by Columbia and everything. You know everything. It's she covers everything that you need about this topic, and what I like about this, she's very unbiased.
Well, I think that's gonna do it for us on this episode. Again, thank you all for watching. For more content,
please subscribe to this channel, and you can also go on to nakotadefonso.com, where I also have the videos and I also have other content on that website. We will see you all in the next episode.